Tonight's story of the strange, weird, and unsolved is the execution of Murderous Mary. In the year 1879, in the northeast corner of Tennessee, nestled in the foothills of what would become the Smoky Mountains National Park, existed a little town called Erwin. Now, Erwin had a dream similar to the dream of many little towns at that time, and it was to become a big city. Erwin was well on its way when the federal government granted it its very own post office. Much like we've become accustomed to today, the federal government screwed that up overnight when they misspelled the word Erwin, and when the post office was erected, the name on the post office was Erwin. Now, the person who donated the land for this city, J.N. Erwin, was probably a little upset by this, and the town spent the next 12 years trying to correct the misspelling. Finally, in 1891, the town gave up and decided just to incorporate under the name Erwin. Today, Erwin is a town trapped in time. We'll see here some pictures of Erwin as it is today. Picturesque in the mountains. Just a beautiful town stuck in time. You can lose yourself in time just by walking their sidewalks, spending time in their town square. It's similar to Mayberry on Andy Griffith, the old Andy Griffith show. As a matter of fact, the real Mayberry, Mount Airy, North Carolina, is just across the mountains from Erwin. And they're very similar. The old buildings are still there. This town has really embraced its heritage and has stuck with it. A beautiful, clean town. If you ever get the chance to visit it, you probably should. It's something to see. Now, one of the things that is this town's claim to fame is Blue Ridge pottery. Blue Ridge pottery is antique pottery that is very desirable by collectors today. It's known for its floral pattern, as you see here, and a lot of companies are remaking it now, but the original antique Blue Ridge pottery is actually very pricey if you can find it on eBay or anything like that. But that was its claim to fame from 1916 till I think 1957, when Blue Ridge Pottery went out of business. But there was one other claim to fame. Starting in the same year that Blue Ridge Pottery started, 1916, became an incident in Erwin that I think a lot of people in the town would like to forget, although the newer people in the town are embracing it. And that was when Erwin became the only town to ever execute an elephant by hanging. Yeah, that happened here in East Tennessee. So, what happened? Well, I guess we have to go back to September 11th, 1916. When the Sparks Circus was playing a town just north of Kingsport, Tennessee, just up the Clinch River. Playing that town on September 11th in the afternoon show, suddenly the elephant trainer quit, allowing the assistant elephant trainer to move up in rank all the way down to the very bottom, leaving an opening for a new employee. Along came a man named Red Eldridge. Now, Red was just a sometimes hobo, sometimes day laborer, just kind of a never-do-well in the community, and I guess saw his opportunity to go down and apply for the job and see the world, travel with the circus. Maybe that was everyone's dream at that time. But surprisingly, Red got the job, and he was handed a bucket, a stick to poke the elephant with, and a broom. Everything he needed to do his job. His job would basically be cleaning up after the elephant, bathing the elephant, and just making sure it's fed and things like that. He wasn't a trainer or anything like that. But the thing that really astonishes me was that in the circus, you see here by a bill, you can see there Mary is billed as the largest living land animal on Earth. She was the Sparks show's main attraction, their claim to fame, and she was a huge elephant. Now, with that being said, what astonishes me about this is Red, being hired that night, was immediately put in charge of Mary, their number one cash cow, most money revenue animal that they had. Why they put an ignorant, and I say ignorant not in his, but ignorant of the job. Red had never seen an elephant, had probably to that day never heard of an elephant, and was put in charge of the largest animal in the circus. I don't know what the thinking was on that, but it really makes you think hard about Sparks' HR department as to why they would do something like that. But he was put in charge of it. Now, the next day they would be playing Kingsport, Tennessee. And they traveled down the railroad, down the Clinch River to Kingsport. They set up, and that afternoon they had two shows. They had the afternoon show and the night show, the matinee and the night show. Getting ready for the matinee, everything went well. The elephants performed, all the animals performed, everything was fine. When the elephants were done performing, they brought them to the door of the tent where the elephant tenders, which is what Eldridge was, would receive the elephant. And his job that day, right down the gravel road, was a creek. He was to take his elephant, along with the other elephants and their tenders, were to take the elephants down to the creek and let them splash in the creek and generally wash them, and all that. A very simple job to do. And along the way, something happened. Now, we don't know what happened, but exactly, it's been lost to oral history in the mountains of Tennessee. But along the way, Mary would kill Red Eldridge. Now, what I have here is some of the oral history from the archive as to what happened. And we have 4 scenarios of what could have happened based on eyewitnesses of the time. Scenario 1 says, after the day's performance at Kingsport, Eldridge was to take Mary to a nearby creek where she would drink and he could bathe her. So far, we're following the narrative that we've come to expect. Along the way, Mary found a watermelon rind in the street and reached down to pick it up. This isn't hard to believe. I mean, it's a festival kind of atmosphere in the town. People eating watermelons, one thing or another, and probably one was dropped on the ground. So Mary reached down to pick it up. For some reason, this enraged Red Eldridge. I don't know why, but he jerked on Mary's chain, according to this a set of events, making Mary trumpet with agitation. She wanted her watermelon. Okay. Red then made matters worse by poking Mary with a sharpened stick, the club that they had given him. He poked her with the sharpened end of it. The pachyderm swung her trunk and grabbed the tender around the waist and slung him into a nearby drink stand. She then wandered over and placed her foot on his head and, according to the witness, popped it like a grape. Witnesses claimed to hear a large pop before brain matter splattered the side of a nearby building. Mary then wandered back over to the line of elephants, took the elephant in front of her tail with her trunk, and join the procession down the street. Scenario 2. And this one was reported in press accounts at the time and is a very simple story. Mary collided her trunk about Eldridge's body and hurled him into the air. She would then gore Eldridge with her tusk and later trample him into a bloody mess. Finally, she would pick up what was left of the laborer and throw him into the crowd. Third scenario, and the most simple, was she simply mashed him when he walked between her and a building. That one's probably not true because they were walking down a street. So don't really think that one is the case. Scenario 4 is Mary suffered from a toothache and the inept Eldridge, ignorant of his job, prodded her in a sore spot near her mouth. Enraged with pain, Mary struck out and killed the man. Now the thing is, whatever happened doesn't really matter. Eldridge was killed, murdered, if you will, by an elephant. But the real story's been lost to time, and these are the stories that are passed down from time to time, and we really don't know what happened. But what we do know is that Mary killed Red Eldridge. Now, with that being said, in a time before the internet, really a time before phones, the story got out quickly. It was spreading from town to town, and it got worse every town it got to until at the end Mary had killed 8 people. Mary had killed many people before. Mary had rampaged. We know that's not true. Whatever she did to kill Red Eldridge, she killed him and then simply got back in line. But as that traveled down from town to town, to the very towns that the circus would be going to in the next few days, word came back from those towns that the circus would not be welcome in the town if Mary came with them. Now, the thing is, Mary was the cash cow. As you saw, she was the #1 billing for this circus. And Mary was a huge elephant. You see there in that third picture, that's Mary. And you see where the people there come up to Mary. They barely come up to her stomach. If you've been to a modern day circus, the trainers and stuff generally come up to the elephant's eye, just below the elephant's eye. You can see there how big Mary was. Mary was a huge, huge elephant. Now, they had to do something. They couldn't lose the revenue of going to these towns. So, they saw the writing on the wall. They would have to do in their main elephant, their big attraction. Mary had to die. So, Sparks started looking at his different options that he had, and one was shooting the elephant. And a mountaineer came forwards with a gun and was ordered to shoot Mary. 5 shots from that gun were fired into Mary's head, and people standing nearby claimed that Mary had more of a reaction to the shots being fired, the sound of the gun, than she did the actual projectile striking her head. So then the sheriff came up, and his opinion was they had gone wrong by shooting Mary in the head, that they should have shot her in the body. He draws a large pistol that he carried and fired several rounds into Mary's abdomen. Witnesses at the time said that the bullets had very little effect. They made a place on her, but Mary didn't seem to really even pay any attention to it, and it certainly did not fatally injure the elephant. So that was out, but she had to die. Now, sometime before this, Edison in Coney Island had executed an elephant to demonstrate his electricity. He had electrocuted the elephant. Well, the problem was that Kingsport, one, didn't have Edison, and two, didn't have enough electricity at that time to really do anything like that. So that was pretty much out. Someone in the crowd came forward. Now, Kingsport being a rail town, they came forward and said, we can tie Mary to the tracks and collide two railroad engines together and crush Mary between them. Not surprisingly, the railroad said, hey, we're not going to lose two rail engines to this endeavor. So they put a stop to that and said, no, we're not going to do that. Well, that same person then said, okay, well, if you're not going to do that, let's tie Mary between two engines and pull her apart. I can only imagine the thoughts on the railroad's minds when they said, no, thank you, we don't wish to be part of this. We're not going to have any part in killing this elephant. So finally, someone in the town realized that the solution to their problem was in Erwin, Tennessee, the next town down the tracks. Erwin, Tennessee was home to a railroad derrick, in this picture here, owned by the Clinchfield Railroad, and it was the derrick number 1400. The 1400 was a self-propelled derrick, and it was huge for its day. This derrick was famous up and down the East Coast. It worked Virginia all the way down through Tennessee. If there was a derailment, this derrick was big enough to go pick up a steam engine and set it back on the tracks. There was their salvation. They were going to hang Mary from the derrick in Erwin. So the arrangements were made, and that night they played the matinee. They went ahead and played the matinee the night after Eldridge was killed in Kingsport. Mary, again, did not perform. She was chained up outside, and the people honestly were a little upset that Mary didn't perform. It kind of, I guess they wanted to see the elephant. It was... So, after the performance, the elephants were all loaded onto a rail car for the trip to Erwin, where Mary would be hung. Now, as they made their way to Erwin, the 1400 was a few miles on the other side of Erwin, and a messenger was sent on a bicycle to get the 1400 steamed up and on its way back to Erwin. When he got there, he told the derrick operators that they were needed in Erwin immediately, and they loaded up their things, started to Erwin. He didn't tell them what the job was, so they assumed it was probably going to be a derailment, unloading cargo, something like that. So they steamed their way back to Erwin, Tennessee, and only in Erwin were they told what their job was, to which the men said no. They didn't want any part of it. They had heard what Mary had done, and they didn't want to be exposed to this elephant. And only after being told all they had to do was to push the button that the circus workers would chain Mary to the derrick did they agree to do it. Now, the circus went ahead and set up and had their matinee show while the derrick was getting ready. In the matinee show, again, the people at the show were a little upset that Mary wasn't going to perform. She was chained up again outside the tent, but at least the people got to walk by Mary and see Mary this time. And some of the witnesses said that Mary seemed agitated and was pacing back and forth. But they went in, they saw the show, and to make up for Mary not being in the show, Sparks, being the showman that he was, said, "Hey, at no extra cost to you, after the show, follow us down the street to see Mary executed." No extra cost, by the way. So, after the show, they led the elephants out, chained Mary between the other elephants, and led her down the street to her doom. Arriving At the yard, Mary would be chained to the track in front of the derrick. One foot would be tied to the track. Now, what happened there was that when she's chained, the other elephants were led behind the building away from the chaos of what was going to happen. And by the time all was chained up, the circus workers had chained Mary to the derrick. 2,500 people had showed up to watch the hanging of this elephant. When the signal was given, the derrick fired up and began to lift Mary off the ground by the neck. Unfortunately, Mary's foot was still chained to the rail, and as the derrick lifted, Mary wasn't budging, her leg still attached to the rail. The derrick pulled as hard as it could, and a rip began to show in front of Mary's hip, where it was basically pulling her apart. At that point, the 7/8 inch chain, the lifting of Mary had become too much. The chain broke, and Mary plummeted back to the ground, landing on her hindquarters. Mary trumpeted in pain and began screaming. It enraged the other elephants, the elephants behind the building, and they began to trumpet back. Mary would trumpet at them. They would trumpet back. They pulled on their chains. They were trying to get to Mary. They knew something was wrong. The crowd began to scatter. One, they were afraid that Mary would charge and kill everyone there. And two, they thought the other elephants might get loose and come to Mary's aid. Little did they know that one, the other elephants were chained very well. They couldn't get away. And two, in the fall, Mary had broken a hip. She was no longer able to stand, much less charge the crowd. It wasn't going to happen. Quickly, a circus worker climbed Mary's back and replaced the chain around her neck with a larger chain. After he got off of Mary, the derrick fired up and began to lift Mary off the ground, having unchained her foot this time. Mary dangled from the derrick for over an hour until she strangled to death. A local veterinarian pronounced Mary dead. Shortly thereafter, a steam shovel arrived at the rail yard. And down the track in an empty place, the steam shovel dug a hole. Once it was deep enough, the derrick brought Mary to the hole, and as she was lowered into the hole, Sparks ordered his men to cut her tusk off, as ivory was worth money. She was lowered into the hole and quickly buried by the steam shovel. That in itself is sad enough, but there's more to the story. That night, after the nightly show, they went ahead and had the nightly show after Mary was executed. The elephants performed, every animal performed, nothing untoward happened. But after the rest of the elephants performed and they were led to the door to be taken and cleaned and fed, the elephants, all four of them, bolted and started down the road. Now, these elephants were going down the road, probably a very scary sight to see, but they weren't charging anyone. They weren't running fast. They were just walking down the road and would not return to the command of their tenders. And they walked all the way to the rail yard. Now, bear in mind that Mary was hung near the turntable, but she was buried some distance away. They walked right past the turntable, straight to where Mary was buried, and they had no idea where she was buried. They were around behind the building. But they knew where their friend was buried, and they formed a circle around where Mary was buried and stood there silently for over an hour. That's amazing to me. No matter what the tenders did, the elephants wouldn't leave Mary. They stood there with her for over an hour. And when the time was up, they simply turned and walked back to the circus. It's like they were grieving their friend, that they wanted to visit their friend's grave. That to me is amazing. We see all the shows about the intelligence of elephants, and this tells me their ability to grieve, their ability to care. Just amazing. But the other thing that I wanted to point out in this is how unfair all this was to Erwin, Tennessee. Erwin, Tennessee is now known as the town that executed an elephant. And it's something that they've tried to live down for years and kind of shied away from. Although now, if you see here in the Erwin pictures I showed earlier through Google, we're going to see this. They're beginning to embrace what happened with statues. Some of the town's little businesses are named after the elephant or what happened. They're beginning to embrace it now, but for years they've been the brunt of the town that executed an elephant. That's very, to me, unfair. In researching this, I realized that the town that executed an elephant was Kingsport. Kingsport just skated on this, got out of it scot-free, simply by asking another town to use their derrick. Kingsport executed the elephant. At worst, Erwin was simply guilty of being good neighbors and loaning something to their neighbor. So some of the ridicule that they took for years, to me, was unwarranted. And Erwin has gone so far to even working with elephant rescue organizations and stuff. I can't say enough about this little town. It was a terrible, terrible time in the early 1900s, a different time than it was today. And while Erwin stays pretty much the way it was visibly, it has changed so much over the years. Yes, it's a town stuck in time. It's like traveling back in time when you see this town. But how much they've done to modernize is also amazing to me. And Erwin is a great town. If you ever get a chance to visit it, I know people come to East Tennessee for Dollywood and things like that. There's so much you're missing by not visiting towns like Erwin. If you get a chance, stop by and see it. You can't see Mary's grave. It's lost to time. She's still buried there. But the rail yard has changed. Nobody's really sure exactly where she's buried anymore. They can get you close, but if you get a chance, stop by Erwin. It's well worth the trip. So that's it for this story, The Killing of Murderous Mary. Until next time, thank you for stopping by.